From childhood, we're told, just be nice and the world will treat you well. But niceness, when rooted in fear, is not strength, it's surrender. A man who lives to please others is not respected. He is tolerated. He blends into the background, never taking a stand, never creating impact. He waits for validation that never comes, and he thinks by avoiding offense, he'll be accepted. But truth, the world does not reward those who hide. It elevates those who own their identity, speak with conviction, and aren't afraid to draw lines in the sand. The weakness behind agreeableness. Being nice is often mistaken for being good. We've been conditioned to believe that niceness is a virtue, that politeness, agreeableness, and passive courtesy are the markers of a morally upright man. But the truth is far more uncomfortable. Niceness, without the backbone of strength, is rarely rooted in morality. It's rooted in fear, the fear of being disliked, the fear of conflict, the fear of rejection, discomfort, and confrontation. Most men who pride themselves on being nice aren't living in alignment with their values. They're living in avoidance. They shapeshift to avoid upsetting others. They walk on eggshells, terrified of making anyone uncomfortable. And they believe, deep down, that if they can just be agreeable enough, compliant enough, soft enough, then maybe, just maybe, they'll finally be accepted. But what they don't realize is that this form of self-erasure is not admired. It is pitied, it is used, and eventually, it is discarded. A man who cannot hold the line, who cannot say no, who cannot disagree when it matters, is not respected. He is overlooked. He blends into the sea of the forgettable, indistinct from the hundreds of other men who live to please. Because the world, particularly women, does not crave the man who always agrees. They crave the man who stands for something, the man who can walk into any room and remain unchanged by it, the man who speaks his truth, not with arrogance or volume, but with certainty and calm. And herein lies the great misunderstanding. A man who avoids conflict isn't peaceful. He's terrified. He isn't harmonious. He's hiding. His life is a performance, one long act of self-suppression. He believes he's being kind, but in truth, he's being manipulative. He manipulates reality by smoothing its edges, hiding his opinions, and tiptoeing through life in hopes that no one notices his quiet desperation. But people do notice. They notice the absence of conviction, the lack of edge, the missing spark, and they conclude, often subconsciously, that he is not to be taken seriously, that he is safe, but not secure, that he is pleasant, but not powerful. There is no nobility in harmlessness. There is only invisibility. Respect does not arise from being agreeable. It arises from being grounded, being anchored in your values, being able to look someone in the eye and say, I disagree, without rage, without apology, and without fear. Respect is commanded by the man who is capable of saying no, of setting limits, of defending himself and what he believes in. But more importantly, he's capable of restraint. He doesn't need to dominate others to feel strong. He doesn't need to win every argument to feel valid. His power is internal. It is quiet, calm, and unshakable. And that's what makes it so dangerous and so deeply respected. So, if you think that being liked is the path to strength, you've misunderstood the entire game. The man who tries to be liked by everyone ends up being respected by no one, because in his chase for acceptance, he abandons authenticity. And in doing so, he abandons the very thing that makes a man admirable: his spine, his clarity, his self-trust. The world doesn't need more nice men. It needs real men. Men who are kind, yes, but from a place of strength, not submission. Men who are capable of great force, but choose measured calm. Men who can lead, protect, and challenge. Not because they want control, but because they refuse to disappear. And the man who refuses to disappear, that man will never be ignored again. How the nice guy loses himself. The tragedy of the nice guy is not just that he's overlooked, it's that he erases himself in the process of trying to be seen. He convinces himself that silence is noble, that agreement is virtuous, and that going along with the flow is the mature thing to do. But deep down, what he's really doing is abandoning himself, bit by bit, day by day. He tells himself that he's being kind, that he's avoiding unnecessary conflict, that he's just being easygoing. But the truth is more painful. He's compromising his integrity to be liked. He doesn't share his opinions unless they're guaranteed to be well received. He doesn't challenge ideas, even when he knows they're wrong. He doesn't assert his needs because he's terrified that doing so will make him seem selfish or unlovable. So instead of showing up fully as himself, he molds, he adapts. He becomes whoever he thinks others want him to be in that moment. With his boss, he's agreeable. With his partner, he's submissive. With his friends, he's a yes man. He trades his truth for approval, his instincts for compliance, his masculine edge for acceptance. And what he doesn't realize, until it's far too late, is that this constant shape-shifting costs him something irreplaceable, his identity. He loses the very essence of who he is, all in an effort to be accepted by people who wouldn't value the real him anyway. He becomes a shell of a man. Pleasant, sure. Polite, always. But potent? Never. He's invisible, not because he lacks presence, but because he refuses to assert it. He blends in so well that people forget he's there. He's the one others talk over, the one who never disagrees, the one who never gets chosen. Not because he's flawed, but because he's too afraid to be fully real. In sacrificing his authenticity to gain approval, he becomes forgettable, safe, predictable. And in relationships, romantic or professional, predictability is the death of desire. Worse yet, he begins to resent others for not seeing him, not respecting him, not admiring him. But how can they? He hasn't given them anything real to admire. He's presented them with a sanitized, filtered version of himself, a version crafted for mass approval, not deep connection. And approval, especially when earned through submission, is fleeting. The moment he stops performing, the moment he reveals a different opinion, the mask slips, and with it, whatever shallow connection he had built. Because when people realize the person in front of them was never being authentic, they don't feel compassion. They feel deceived. Over time, this man starts to feel empty. He looks in the mirror and doesn't see a leader, a warrior, a builder. He sees someone who has spent years trying not to offend, not to be noticed, not to be a problem. But the world doesn't reward men who try not to be a problem. It rewards men who solve them. The nice guy becomes a chronic apologizer. He apologizes for wanting more. He apologizes for needing space. He apologizes for being upset. He's constantly censoring himself, walking on emotional eggshells, trying to keep the peace in relationships that aren't built on truth, but on performance. And in the end, what does he have to show for it? Shallow connections, stunted growth, a life that feels muted. He may be surrounded by people, but he feels utterly alone because no one truly knows him. And how could they? He doesn't even know himself anymore. He's spent so long trying to be acceptable that he's forgotten how to be authentic. The bitter truth is this: the nice guy doesn't lose because he's too kind. He loses because he's too afraid. Afraid to draw a line, afraid to be disliked, afraid to be alone. But what he fails to see is that authenticity always carries risk, and real connection requires courage. The man who cannot face rejection will never experience true intimacy, because intimacy begins where performance ends. So, if you are that man, always nodding, always yielding, always adapting, it's time to ask yourself a hard question. Who are you, really, when you're not trying to be liked? Because that version of you, that raw, unfiltered, unapologetic version, is the only one that can ever be respected, admired, and loved. Yos, what women actually respect. There's a common misconception among men that what women truly want is someone agreeable, always kind, endlessly accommodating. That if you just nod, smile, and never rock the boat, you'll be rewarded with affection, admiration, and commitment. But the reality is far more primal, far more complex, and far more honest. Women do not fall in love with shadows. They do not crave echoes. They do not admire men who vanish into the background of their own lives. They are drawn, deeply instinctively, to presence, to men who command space, to men who are rooted in something deeper than people-pleasing, to men who know who they are and are unapologetic about it. It's not about dominance. It's not about arrogance. It's about direction. Women are drawn to men who move with purpose, not permission, who act with conviction, not hesitation. A man who owns his space, not by raising his voice or puffing out his chest, but simply by the way he stands, speaks, and exists. There is an unmistakable gravity in a man who doesn't need to be liked to feel secure, and that gravity is magnetic. Because the man who agrees with everything is not seen as empathetic, he's seen as hollow. The man who avoids boundaries isn't seen as easygoing, he's seen as soft. The man who waits to speak, waits to act, waits for someone to validate his thoughts. He doesn't inspire respect, he inspires doubt, he inspires uncertainty. And nothing kills attraction faster than a man who can't lead himself. Attraction, true, soul-deep attraction, is rooted in certainty, in conviction, in the steady presence of a man who will not waver in the face of emotion, disagreement, or pressure. The man who can hold space for a woman, not collapse under the weight of her emotions. The man who can say no with calm, who can disagree without fear, who can stay grounded when tested. That's the man who makes a woman feel safe. Not because he gives her everything she wants, but because he gives her what is real. And realness isn't always soft. Sometimes it's raw, sometimes it's uncomfortable, sometimes it's even confrontational. But it's never fake, it's never dishonest. And that's what sets the man of substance apart. He's not trying to be someone, he is someone. And that presence, grounded, clear, and unwavering, is what commands attention, desire, and loyalty. Women are emotional creatures by nature, not because they're irrational, but because they're intuitive. They feel what you're afraid to say. They sense when you're posturing. They know when your confidence is fake, when your smiles are hollow, when your validation-seeking hides a core of insecurity. And they may tolerate it for a while, but they don't respect it. And what they don't respect, they cannot love. Love requires strength. Not physical strength alone, but emotional sovereignty. The kind of man who doesn't ask for permission to exist. The kind of man who can handle a woman's fire without losing himself. The kind of man who can challenge her when she needs it, hold her when she breaks, and never lose sight of his own mission in the process. That's what women respect. That's what they crave. Not compliance, but courage. Not softness, but security. Not a reflection, but a force. A man who makes them think, feel, and grow. A man who doesn't collapse when challenged. A man who holds the line, even when it's hard, even when it's lonely, even when it costs him approval. So, if you think being the nice guy will earn you love, think again. Because what women actually respect isn't the man who tiptoes around them. It's the man who can stand firm beside them, who refuses to be anything but himself, who lives on purpose and pulls her into a bigger world simply by living his truth. That's the man who stays in her mind. That's the man she talks about, thinks about, and respects. Not because he tried to be what she wanted, but because he had the courage to be exactly who he is. The mission comes first. If your life revolves around the pursuit of women, you will always feel hollow, always chasing, always wondering why it never feels like enough. Because women are not your purpose. They are not the reason you were born. They are not the axis upon which your self-worth should turn. If you make them your mission, you will lose both the mission and yourself. You will become reactive, off balance, constantly adjusting your identity to fit into a life you don't own. And worst of all, you will not be respected, not by others, not by women, and not by yourself. A man who has no direction becomes a satellite, spinning around someone else's orbit, dependent on their gravity to feel important. But a man with a mission, he is the sun, he radiates, he sets the pace. He pulls others into his world, not by force, but by the sheer intensity of his purpose. You must understand this. Companionship is not the foundation of your life. Purpose is. Love will come. Connection will come. But only when you have rooted yourself so deeply in who you are that no external presence can unmake you. The man who follows others will always be replaceable. He has no identity beyond who he tries to impress. The man who bends too easily eventually breaks because he has no core. He fears tension, so he never develops strength. He fears loneliness, so he never learns solitude. He fears rejection, so he never builds resilience. But the man who builds, he doesn't chase. He doesn't ask to be chosen. He becomes the one others gravitate toward. He is a builder, a leader, a force of nature. He wakes up each day with a mission in mind. He's driven not by insecurity, but by vision. He is too focused to get distracted by short-term gratification, too disciplined to allow external opinions to dictate his course. He is comfortable walking alone because his purpose walks with him. His fulfillment doesn't come from being liked. It comes from building something greater than himself. And that is what makes him irreplaceable. He is remembered not because he begged for attention, but because he built something that demanded it. So, do not live your life waiting to be chosen. Do not live for hearts, likes, or attention. Choose yourself. Choose your path. Define your standards. Craft your discipline. And defend your time as if your life depends on it, because it does. The man who dares to walk his own path, to suffer for his dream, to delay gratification for long-term greatness, that man becomes unshakable. That man becomes immortal in the minds of others. Because people don't follow the man who fits in. They follow the man who stands out, who rises above mediocrity through action, clarity, and purpose. Be that man. Be the one who creates, who leads, who carves his mission into the world like stone. Because when you become something more than yourself, when your life becomes about more than being liked, you become impossible to ignore. You don't need to impress. You become impressive. You don't need to chase. You become the gravity. That's how admiration is earned. That's how respect is commanded. And that's how you become the man who never has to ask to be chosen. Because he already chose himself, long before the world even noticed. At the end of it all, the truth is brutally clear. The world does not wait for you to step into your potential. It does not hand you permission to become great. It does not offer approval to the man who hides, who hesitates, who hopes that being agreeable will somehow be enough. It rewards the man who chooses himself first, who stops seeking validation and starts seeking mastery. The man who stops chasing affection and starts chasing excellence. The man who no longer bends to fit into the expectations of others, but forges himself into something that even the world cannot ignore. You were not born to be tolerated. You were not meant to blend in. You are not here to be convenient, quiet, or comfortable. You are here to build, to lead, to become undeniable. And that begins the moment you stop asking who you need to be for others and start asking who you were meant to be, regardless of who approves. This is not about women. It's not about relationships. It's about the foundation upon which your entire life is built. If you do not respect yourself, no one else will. If you do not stand for something, you will fall for everything. And if you do not rise into the man you are capable of becoming, you will forever live in the shadow of those who dared to do the hard work you avoided. Stop waiting. Stop bending. Stop explaining. From this day forward, choose yourself. Build your body. Sharpen your mind. Fortify your mission. And let the world feel your presence, not because you begged for attention, but because you earned it through action. If this message hit you deep, then do one thing right now. Comment below with, "I choose myself." Share this video with a man who's forgotten his worth. Subscribe for more unfiltered truth. No fluff, no apologies, just raw self-mastery. Your time is now, not next week, not next year, now. Because the longer you wait to become the man you were meant to be, the further away he gets. Be undeniable, be respected, be remembered. Choose yourself now.